Justin A.W. Blair here, writer, painter, YouTuber, man who delves through the strata of science fiction and fantasy of the 80s and the 90s. I am bringing you today a strange one, Breeder by Jim Morris. Breeder. Now, longtime viewers of the channel will know that I found a gargantuan cake or cachet of old paperbacks from the 1980s, early 90s, and 70s at a library sale. I've been exploring old science fiction, old fantasy, trying to see what was going on back then. This was published, like so many of these paperbacks that I got, I believe in 1988. 88 was a big year for whoever had this collection before myself. Big year in sci-fi fantasy. This is a book which, first off, some of you can't handle. This is a book which deals with some subject matter which will not be appropriate for some modern readers of today. I'm going to give you that warning now. In fact, I'm going to give you, what do they call it? The kids call it these days, the trauma warning or whatever. I don't know what it's called, but I don't like long commercials in the middle of a YouTube video, so I'll get to the point quick. My own novel written by me, Justin A.W. Blair, entitled The Haunt on the Island of Esmer, is out, available on Amazon. You can buy it in ebook or paperback format. It's hard to even get into this, and I usually don't give a plot synopsis, but to give you a sense of how bizarre this book is, I do need to do that. And I'm going to read you a few passages from it as well. I would call this novel part mega chud military fiction, part Cold War absurdist spy novel, and part male power fantasy, part gonzo fiction. I don't usually use phrases such as male power fantasy to describe anything, but I gotta be honest with you. This is, you'll understand when I explain the plot to you. Before I do that, a brief word on the author, who I'm not sure if he is living or deceased. I looked it up before I came in here, as I always do. Went out on the porch in the dark of night, in night's darkness, to smoke a cigarette and think things over before I record. And so during that time, I was like, let's see who Jim Morris is. From what I can tell, he was a combatant in the Vietnam War, I believe with the Green Berets. So he was an actual special forces operator. He, I believe, either served 3 missions or 3 tours of duty. And on the 3rd, he was wounded really badly to the point where he had to come back home. I am not a military sci-fi guy, so I can't speak to the veracity of some of the tropes you find in military sci-fi. There's a lot of specific descriptions of guns, usually in military sci-fi. This is set in, I think it's set in 1991, so it's not really a far future science fiction book or anything. You can tell in a sense that this guy actually was in the armed forces. The other reason you can tell that is because there's a certain type of humor and a certain type of joke that I've found that people who have been in the military, when they are writers, they make, and I know that they go over my head. One of the important things about being a reader is to understand what you're missing. I think that you have to understand that. You have to say to yourself, if you haven't been in the military, hey, I haven't been in the military. I'm not going to get some of these jokes. I'm not going to get some of what's going on. Apparently, Mr. Morris started taking LSD, I guess, and then got into like Native American spirituality. He kind of MK Ultra'd himself a little bit, but like therapeutically, I suppose. I guess. Look, I'm not judging. The guy actually fought in a war, probably saw a lot of violence. I think that if you have killed people in war or been injured, you get to like Carlos Castaneda. I think that you're allowed to like Carlos Castaneda if you have committed a war crime. I think it's fair. You're allowed that. I'm not saying he committed a war crime at all. Anyway, apparently, and again, this is just a brief biography I read before I came in here. Strange life. Started taking LSD, went skydiving in LSD, and then became, I guess, a correspondent, or not a correspondent, but there's a better word for it, but a talking head on MSNBC with regards to special operations. So, really a kind of, I won't say typical life of a baby boomer, but a certain type of American. This is a certain type of an American who wrote this book at a certain time and place in the year 1988. So let's keep that in mind as we go forward. The good and the bad, I often set things up like that. But first, I feel like I really do have to explain some of the plot to you. If you plan on reading Breeder by Jim Morris in 1988, close your ears and come back here in a couple minutes, because there will be some spoilers coming up here. It's hard to almost explain what happens in this book because it's so weird. And at the beginning of it, I was reading it and I didn't know where I stood. I didn't know what was going on here. I will say this. After about 100 pages, I started understanding that I should be reading this book through the lens of a kind of acid trip satire in a way. Now, that doesn't entirely work because it's not entirely that. The book starts out with a letter from someone else to his kid, and he's telling his kid that he is not his real biological father, that this other man named Jeff was. Okay, so we have a bit of a mystery. Then we are taken to a military, like a cadet school. I don't know what cadet school really means, like a military college or something, or a college but with an ROTC program or something. Again, if you're not in the military or know these terms, like I don't know the terms exactly, but he's a soldier trained to be a soldier, but it also kind of seems like a college town somewhere in North Texas or Oklahoma. I'm going to read you now. I'm going to read you just a couple paragraphs from page 6 of this book so you can understand that I braved my way through this, and you can understand maybe my confusion. So this is Jeff with his roommate just joshing around, just wrestling. For Jeff's part, he usually had more fun with his enemies than with his friends. He stepped back to the mirror and examined his features, putting the shaving cream over his face now, a classically handsome face with dimples, topped by a mop of slightly wavy blonde hair. He had to stoop a little to see in the mirror since he was 2 meters tall, and his shoulders crowded out of the mirror because he weighed 100 kilos and had a 29-inch waist. He smiled a little in the mirror, a charming, sensual smile that displayed clear, even white teeth and brought his dimples into startling relief. He was the creme de la creme, and he knew it. Except for the dimples and a 10-inch penis, he looked exactly like Michelangelo's David. Now that's a sentence that goes down to the history books as far as I'm concerned. So I'm reading this, it's page 6. I'm like, what the fuck am I doing? Is this gay? Is this some gay military science fiction? What's happening here? Continuing with the plot, Jeff, after dominating through wrestling his roommate and shaving, goes out on a really long run and then basically stands by the library waiting for women, and then kind of, and again, look, man, my YouTube channel is doomed from the beginning. I'm reviewing forgotten books from 1988, so I'm not really going to change my language for the algorithm. He basically hangs out and then rapes a co-ed. Okay, now this is where things get disturbing, but also difficult to explain. There's going to be a lot more rapes throughout the book. They are characterized. First, they're not described in any detail at all. Secondly, It is understood shortly thereafter that it is not exactly rape because Jeff has some sort of almost supernatural ability to attract women to have immediate sexual relations with him. Something unnatural is occurring. Okay? Let me continue along with the plot. So we don't really like this guy, actually. The reader doesn't really like this guy. And you know right off the bat, pretty much, that this is not a likable person. He then knifes to death one of his instructors, but that's apparently within the rules of the cadet college or whatever. You're allowed to kill your instructor. And we start to get the sense that something's not right, obviously, kind of from the beginning. That this maybe is not a normal military school. But our character Jeff doesn't know that himself, and he then graduates and decides that he's going to ignore the orders that he's gotten because they want to make him an instructor. And so he just ditches those, types out his other orders, disables someone else that's supposed to be on a plane flying to go do a mission, boards the plane, and then as he's flying realizes that the stars, when he wakes up close to the destination, now remember, he thinks he's in Texas or Oklahoma or something. He realizes when he gets on the plane, everyone's kind of fat, and also that the stars are not in the right place in the sky. Okay, let me explain to you what's actually happened, which is revealed relatively soon in the book. Jeff is a super soldier genetic experiment. And this is given to us basically via a scientist who is a Russian that is explaining something in a classroom just a little bit before this. But they have developed rats which are alpha rats, which kill the beta rats, males, and breed with the women rats. And then basically it's understood that that's what he is. However, this is all part of a secret Soviet, remember this is 1988, so the Soviet Union is still the bad guy. This is all part of a secret Soviet spy plot. And Jeff himself realizes he is a pawn of sorts in this spy plot, in that he is one of these genetic super soldiers meant to go to America and breed with all of the American women he can. And there's thousands of other super soldiers like this that are insinuated into America to breed with all the women, and that somehow this is going to then make the American population demoralized and weak because, and here's where this doesn't really make sense to me, all of the super soldiers are sterile. So they go to America, seduce all the women, and this makes the American men not able to breed with the women. But then this is what doesn't make any sense because they're sterile. So they're not actually impregnating the women. This is where that becomes very murky and it doesn't really make sense, frankly, at all. The problem is Jeff, when he threw his orders away, he was an accident of a genetic experiment in that he's not sterile. And the unsterile ones, I guess, are supposed to be kept back because they aren't supposed to go to America. Because if super soldier genetic experiment Jeff breeds with the American women population, he'll create American super people that will then defeat the Soviet Union in the future. There's so many things that are outlandish about this, and that I was like, this is dumb. This doesn't make sense as I'm reading it. But here's the thing. If you're going to read a book like this, what I realize is you just have to let that go. You just got to let it go and go with it. Apparently, okay, so Jeff then realizes that he actually had grown up in the Soviet Union in a place in the Crimea, which was made to look like the Texas Plains. Everything was like a fake Potemkin Village of an American university except changed somewhat. Obviously, from what would actually happen in America, you wouldn't have like rules where you can kill your own instructor and all this stuff. But he doesn't know that. But he's exposed to American television and culture and that kind of stuff to a degree, but it's all a little bit off. So he finds himself in America now. And this again doesn't quite make sense. Because I don't even know if he actually takes over. He doesn't really take a different identity. He just shows up and is like, I want to fight. And so then they're like, okay, go to Mexico. So now, okay, this is crazy. I don't know if I should explain all this to you. In a way, it's almost worth reading because of how bizarre it is. I'm not actually going to explain the entire plot. I don't think I am, just in case there's one person out there who wants to pick up a copy of Breeder by Jim Morris. That part of the plot gets you to an understanding of the craziness that's going on. It gets more bizarre. It gets more and more bizarre. So I do have to say this. Jeff eventually takes hostage. We'll use the word seduces rapidly. Look, rapid seduction actually might be a more fair term for what is depicted in this book. He rapidly seduces a Texas lady who has a kid already. And then apparently Jeff has never actually seen a real human child before. He also, by the way, he knows when he breeds with women, he's kind of like almost computerish. Like he says they're in the glow, which I think realistically probably just means that they are at a point where they can be impregnated, and that information or the ability to sense that has been genetically imprinted into him as an experimental subject. Regardless, he sees the first child he's ever seen in his life, apparently. And this starts to make Jeff the super soldier, rapist, murderer, because, by the way, he murders a lot in this, a great deal. And it really is just murder. Like that gets complicated too. But the existence of a child makes him kind of sad. And then as a reader, you're kind of like, okay, yeah, this is not, in some sense, you can't judge this person on the type of morality that you would use with a normal human. He's a genetic experiment, not really even a human. That plays out through a lot of the book, though he's a completely unlikable character in so many ways, because there's zero sense of any type of morality, really, except they slip in there a little bit, like he doesn't like to kill women and children and stuff. He's like, I'm happy I never had to do that or something. Even though he does then kill multiple women throughout the book. Though usually in a somewhat combat situation, except for one, which I will explain. And in a way, it's a way of resolving this problem. Because let's step back from the plot for a second and think about this as a writer and a reader. The issue with this as a writer is, how do you write the bulk of a book in a POV of a character that is alien to most people's sense of morality and ethics and unlikable? Well, in the way that this was approached, and I think it actually makes sense. And as you get into it, like I said, about 150 pages in, you realize you need to start reading this as more of like a gonzo, crazed up. This isn't to be taken seriously. And when I first started reading it, I thought to take it seriously, and it really hit wrong. Then I started to realize, if you think of this more as a kind of absurdist, violent comedy of not so much the 80s, but almost the 70s. But there was, and here's the thing about the 80s, there was a type of surrealistic ultra-violence that was, frankly, a lot more palatable to large swaths of the American population. Surprisingly so much so, I think that many people would be surprised when they go back and not look at the movies from the 80s or the books from the 80s that have risen to the top, that have become critical successes. But if you go back and look at the kind of schlock, the right word? Not even that, just the most basic stuff that came out in the 80s. I think you'll almost get culture shocked at this point in the year 2026. I really do. Leave in the comments if you agree. Leave in the comments if you even know what I'm talking about. It is a strangely gory and violent time in film and literature, the 1980s. And if I wanted to expand on that and kind of think about it, I think some of that comes from the experience of Vietnam, the 1960s, all of that. Those people getting to the age where they are making culture. But that's too broad to talk about. There are two things that are resolved that are actually clever, I think. And again, like with so many books I read, as I start to actually talk to you guys on YouTube about this, I start to like it more. I start to see things in it that are both enjoyable and clever and interesting. Whereas oftentimes I come in not impressed. He falls in with a 40-year-old woman who leads a terrorist gang called the GBs. Now that's a whole thing that happens. Because America is on the brink of civil war. There's all these different factions kind of fighting one another, running drugs. And there's something really clever that he talks about, this kind of fragmentation, how they're all fighting each other. And this guy who's kind of a drug addict, and he, in this stoned out way, explains to him that he's all about freedom. But then they work against the government, but usually oftentimes they're working for the government. There's a type of 60s guy, and I think there's a type of 60s guy that went to Vietnam, saw some bad things, saw the reality of a lot of things, and then came back with a very cynical but sometimes realistic viewpoint of how the government operates. That viewpoint is taken up a lot of notches and put forth in the sense that this GB's gang is running drugs, but they're also working to overthrow the government while simultaneously working for the government. That's all I'll get into about that. Read the book yourself if you want. It's only 300 pages. It reads pretty fast if you want to know more. But we have this issue, like I said, there's two different resolutions to the problem of the POV character being unlikable. So how is this resolved? The first thing that happens is, because any modern reader, even from 1988, is going to be disturbed by the amount of raping done by the super soldier, right? So what happens is he falls in with this gang woman, and there's actually a kind of interesting relationship that evolves there. She becomes very jealous randomly. She's insane. And he looks at a girl supposedly at one point, and she cuts his penis off. And then he strangles her to death. And then that's the end of him being in the gang, and he gets taken back into the army. And the resolution of the rape issue is that he goes into surgery, they reattach his penis, but then he finds that he is caused extraordinary pain when he gets an erection from now on. So that acts as a kind of punishment. It also acts as a way to stop the rape in the book. And it does kind of resolve that moral issue in a weird way. This is actually a rather cruel fate for this person, because again, you really see that this is not a human being. He's not really in control. He doesn't have any sense of the same morality humans do. And so it's a kind of elegant resolution to this issue. The other resolution to the issue is that once he gets out of the hospital, the army pretends that he is going to jail, and then he gets killed in jail for his crimes because he's been robbing banks with this terrorist leader who he was taken hostage by. And then the army says, because there's apparently somehow, this isn't really explained very well, a bunch of these super soldiers, the sterile ones, who have made themselves known to the army. And so now the army, the United States Army, is using them for their own ends, kind of deprogram them to the extent they need deprogramming. and taken them in and made them part of the army. So they're going to now send all these guys back into the Soviet Union on a raid to take back all these children that are being genetically engineered. 9,000 of them, apparently, by the way. And this is again, I'm no military man. I'm no military strategist. Supposedly, they're going to fly 9 C-150s or C-130s or whatever, the big military aircraft. And they're going to somehow round up 9,000 students after they attack this place, this Potemkin Village type place, and then fly them out of the Soviet Union. I didn't know you could fit 1,000 people on one of those big planes. Maybe you can, maybe I'm the fool. It starts to get so insane towards the middle and end of the book that those types of details don't really matter to me as a reader. It might matter to someone who cares about the details of military stuff, which is going to be, I would think, part of the audience for a military science fiction book. The way this resolves is the guy who wrote the letter at the very beginning, the roommate that got bullied, actually, then briefly meets him before they go on this mission because he's going to fly an attack helicopter. The helicopter pilot who was bullied by him, and he kind of hates him, but doesn't really also think about him that much. He's told by the commanding officer that he needs to assassinate him in the Soviet Union during the operation. So there is a lot, I mean, it's not fragging. Yeah, it is fragging, basically, because he would be... Jeff, the super soldier, is the main commanding officer of the on the ground. And then he's instructed, I guess it's not fragging if you get an order. It's illegal. I don't know what it's called, but like he's told by the military to assassinate super soldier Jeff. That's how the book is resolved. The ethical tensions. Jeff can never be the hero of the book, obviously. He's a murdering rapist, super soldier, genetic monstrosity. I'm going to read another passage, chapter 11. I want to just give you a sense of the writing style. The one who had cleared his throat was Brother Fletcher, the soul mechanic. He had assumed a secular and belligerent stance, enhanced by the drum-fed Thompson he held pointed at Jeff's midsection, and the Highway Patrol Model 357 that hung at his hip, as well as the 2 baseball grenades that hung from his handsome hand-tooled leather cowboy belt with silver and turquoise buckle. The son of a bitch is a walking arsenal, Jeff thought. The spade next to him would have been frightening enough stark naked in a YMCA shower, but he too was festooned with weapons from head to foot. With a heavy emphasis on knives, a Randall No. 14 survival knife on his left hip and a Gerber fighting knife on the other. He also had an AK-47 with a spot of rust on the barrel, pointing generally in Jeff's direction. It was hard to tell where he was looking because one of his eyes wandered. Also, he was only about 5'4", although he appeared to weigh maybe 200 pounds, and he had not an ounce of fat on him anywhere. His shaven head glowed dully in the ceiling light, but the gold ring in his ear shone brightly enough, as did a lot of junk jewelry hanging about his person. The other guy was about 30 years old, a farmer in a plaid shirt and a duck hunting cap. A plain old Service 45 auto hung in a GI holster and a pistol belt at his hip, and a well-oiled 12-gauge pump was tucked under his arm. But his pupils were narrowed down to diamond points, and his expression brought an entirely new dimension to the word hate. That last line's pretty good writing. I mean, it's not bad, but it's actually good genre writing. I'd like to end this, though, with something a little current. I usually don't do that much because I don't really care about what the current discourse is. However, my YouTube algorithm is a squirrely place. Part of it is the dialogue about literature and about male and female literature. Reading habits, what they like, what they don't like. My algorithm on Twitter is obviously also geared to that because I care about reading, I care about writing, I care about books. There is a part of the discourse which is that female readers of today are only into smut, fantasy smut, bizarre pornography via the written word. Now, I don't entirely buy that, number one. I don't think that's true, frankly. I think there's some truth to it. I think that those books are popular. but I don't think it tells the entire story. There's another aspect to that story which I never see brought up, and which reading this book made me realize. This isn't very explicit sexually. It's not. There are actually scenes that are, but they're not with Jeff raping people. They're with the few relationships that he have where he actually likes the woman involved and she's a character for a while in the book. And there's two of those. And those are actually relatively detailed and sexually explicit. I think in 1988, you have to realize that at least some percentage, think about it this way. I don't think it's entirely untrue that men don't read a lot of smut. In fact, the word smut is almost coded towards the female reader in some ways. In my mind, anyway. Canceled. I think there was more of a smut literature for men, and I think that it's just simply disappeared because I think men are more visually focused in terms of sexuality, and I think women are more focused on the written word. In 1988, there were less opportunities for men to look at pornography visually. 1988, still VCRs and stuff, right? Like that's the internet doesn't exist. The deluge of pornographic imagery that the internet opened up, that the internet started really, did not exist. So my theory is something like this. Probably women have always preferred, we'll just use the word pornography, even though this doesn't rise to that. This isn't pornography, but let's go with the more neutral word of smut. I think women probably have always been more prone to that in literature than men have. However, I betcha if you took a long look at the 1980s and early 90s, basically, I bet if you did some sort of study, and I'm no scientist, I bet if you looked, you would see as the internet becomes more and more available, you would see a decline in these types of books for male readers, because I think that in terms of sexual content, men went visually to the internet. And I think in terms of, because there is a type of also pornography of violence. Again, maybe I'm sounding like a left winger here, but I think we need to face it. There is pornography of violence. I think that got channeled into video games for young men, where in 1988, for young men to enjoy, whether right or wrong, good or bad, those types of activities, they were in the written word still. And so I think it seems like, in terms of smut, women are weighted way heavier today because I think they didn't go in those same pursuits digitally when that opened up and became available. My theory could be wrong. It's 7 in the morning. I've been up all night. I'm up all night. I sleep all day. I'm kind of possibly a secret Soviet genetic experiment. I don't know. I was not going to recommend this book whatsoever. Then as I started to think about it, look, I'm not going to recommend it exactly. The person, I don't know who needs to read this book. It reads quick. I mean, he's decent at what it is. The writing is uneven in some places. When I looked, I think he's written like 15 books. Most of it's, I think, nonfiction about war. Regardless, look, you know what it's about now. You can choose to read it or not. I think there's a Kindle version of it, and you can still buy the paperback online. It's interesting, if nothing else, for those who like military science fiction. People who really are into the subgenre of military science fiction probably should take a look at this, just since it's so weird. You know, I read it in a couple days. It was kind of interesting. I didn't exactly enjoy it. It was a little too, it just wasn't quite, I'm not really into military sci-fi. It's not, a lot of this stuff with the 1980s and 1990s, fantasy and science fiction, it tries to be humorous in places that I just can't really sync up with. There actually are some decent one-liners in here. There's some decent paragraphs. The story moves really quickly. The pacing is good. The writing isn't bad. I mean, there are places where it's, yes, I think it was written rather quickly. Maybe it's for someone out there. I think it probably is. And I think that if you really want to understand military sci-fi, if you really want to understand this strange time period, right at the very end of the Cold War, 1988, I think this is a book you should maybe pick up and take a look at. That's all for this evening. We will see you next time.